Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Ms. Zimmermann will defend her academic thesis entitled Facilitating Cross-Border Real Estate Transactions in Europe, an Exploration. I welcome all participants to this ceremony here in this aula, and I also welcome all participants who join us online today, including all the members of the degree committee and also including co-supervisor Professor Schulze from the University of Münster. Very much welcome to this ceremony. Ms. Zimmermann, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, members of the Defense Committee, dear family, friends and colleagues. In the next 15 minutes, I will provide a brief overview of my research on the facilitation of cross-border real estate transactions that was done between July 2015 and July 2019. Well, everyone who has at least once been involved in acquiring a plot of land in a national context can testify the complexity of such an undertaking. In case of a cross-border real estate transaction, another level of complexity is added to that process. Take, for example, as indicated on the slide, a Spanish buyer who wishes to acquire a plot of land in Germany from a Spanish seller, or even a situation in which seller, buyer, and plot of land are each located in a different member state. This added level of complexity is due to differences in national property law systems, registration systems, and the roles of the legal practitioners in the different European member states. The purpose of this research was therefore to explore how cross-border real estate transactions can be facilitated. This question was answered in 4 steps. To begin with, it was necessary to first gain an in-depth understanding of how national land registration systems work. In other words, what is the exact procedure that the buyer has to go through from the moment that he finds a suitable house, a plot of land, of course, until the moment that he becomes the owner of that plot of land. An analysis of the registration systems of all European member states would, of course, gone beyond the scope of this research, so therefore a selection had to be made, which in the end included the Netherlands, Germany, as well as England and Wales. This comparative exercise was in the end approached through a common set of questions. Well, first, what is the land registry and cadastral authority in the respective member state and how is it organized? Who is the legal practitioner? And by that I mean the Latin notary in a civil law system and a conveyancer in a common law system. What is the legal rent? Who's the legal rent registrar? And what are the tasks that are accorded to the land registrar? What is the relationship between legal practitioner and land registrar? What kind of information can be registered in a land register? What is its legal value, and can it be publicly accessible? To what extent is land registration digitalized? How does the process of transferring a plot of land work in the context of a purely national situation? And how do these systems approach a cross-border transaction? And last but not least, what is exactly the object of a real estate transactions and how do you define the boundaries? And this is especially a question that is often neglected in comparative exercises in this field. Despite the fact when it comes to boundaries, and here I quote David Powell, every inch is fought over with the ferocity that would not embarrass a First World War general. This brings us to the second step. Well, probably one of the biggest assumptions in cross-border real estate transactions is that they inhibit more challenges than a comparable purely national transaction. Well, quite often this is defended with a reference to the internal market and to the detrimental effect that it has on it. And when it comes to the identification of the exact challenges, only few starting points can be found in the literature, which often include a reference to the translation costs, travel costs, and the mandatory application of the lex cite. Yet, in the absence of such an exact overview of the different challenges, it is almost impossible to formulate efficient strategies for the further facilitation of cross-border real estate transactions. Therefore, it became necessary to first produce such an overview. Well, based on the comparative exercise that was conducted in the first step, many conversations I've had with practitioners in the field in various countries, and last but not least, also based on my own practical experiences that I gained as a legal researcher for the Dutch cadastre, I identified a total of 29 challenges, which I divided into administrative, cultural, technical, and technological challenges. It must be stressed, though, that not all of these challenges only occur in a cross-border context, so some of them also occur in a purely national situation. Well, in fact, only 9 of these 29 challenges occur only in a cross-border situation. The remaining 20 challenges are also faced in a national transaction, but often with a lower impact. It is argued, though, that these obstacles need to be addressed to facilitate cross-border transactions. After all, independently of the question of how many of these obstacles parties are confronted with or the degree of intensity, at the end of the day, the mere existence of these obstacles complicate cross-border transactions and make them more time-consuming and cost-intensive. Well, luckily, though, there are already several initiatives in the field that try to address these problems. So therefore, in the third step, they were analyzed and inventoried. There were 3 observations that were particularly interesting in that. Well, first, as you can see on the slide, the oldest and still existing initiatives dates almost 100 years back, but it is often neglected in leading publications in the field and therefore often overlooked also in practice. Second, it is also worth noticing that the vast majorities of these initiatives are not realized by academics, but by practitioners in the field who have organized themselves in a number of different syndicates. So when it comes to the notaries, we can mention Lex Union, the CNUE, and the International Union of Notaries. When it comes to land registry and cadastre staff, we can mention ULIS, ELRA, the International Properties Registries Association and International Center for Registration Law, Eurogeographics, the International Federation of Surveyors, the Permanent Committee on Cadastre in the European Union, and the European Union of Rechtspflege. The third observation is that despite of all the differences that corner these initiatives in terms of target audience, the approach chosen to reduce the complexity of cross-border transactions, we can observe a process of reinventing the wheel. So for example, if you're looking at the slide, if you look at the attempt to provide a thesaurus for the terminology used in the field, we see that there are 7 different groups that aim to realize this goal, often without learning from the attempts made previously. It goes without saying that this is not in the interest of saving time and money. After the existing initiatives had been systematized and analyzed, they were synchronized with the challenges that were identified in the second step. And it could then be determined to which extent these challenges had already been addressed by the existing initiatives. It turned out then that only 4 of 29 challenges had been fully addressed by the existing initiatives, yet the majority of the remaining 25 challenges have at least been partly addressed. And we can see this over here. After an overview of the current status quo had been created, the big question was how to progress in the future and how can we further facilitate cross-border real estate transactions. Well, the most radical solution, and please bear with me, that was explored was the eradication of all national land registries and cadastral authorities, and to unite them in a European Cadastral Authority and Land Registry, which I called the Gallery. And that approach would go hand in hand with the adoption of a uniform system, uniform registration system, as well as with a uniform property law. We can conclude that the creation of UCalary is capable of eradicating virtually all challenges that I've just shown on the slide. In the absence of a unified European language, though, the necessity of translation will still occur, but it can be significantly reduced through the adoption of a uniform property law. The only challenge that would then still remain would be the application of European Union law. The creation of UCalary could therefore create the impression that it is a very good idea, on first sight at least. But what is the price that needs to be paid for it? Without a doubt, substantial sacrifices and expenses would have to be made. The divergences that can be observed across different European member states in different jurisdictions have often a reason that point back to a country's culture. Such an invasive unification process will therefore also negatively impact cultural diversity in Europe. On a more practical level, it must not be underestimated how challenging the integration of numerous datasets into one giant dataset will be. Well, experiences gained in the English context with the integration of the local land charges register into one centralized local land charges register, or also the updating of the cadastre in the Netherlands, have shown how incredibly complex, though feasible, such a project can be. Probably the biggest condition for the implementation of Eucalary is, however, the passionate conviction of all European governments that such a drastic measure would be necessary. In other words, there's a considerable political element that is attached to the success of this project. For these reasons, only one conclusion is reasonable. Eucalary is an interesting intellectual pastime, but not more than that. In other words, the all-in option is certainly not the most desirable way to facilitate cross-border real estate transactions in Europe. One cannot but agree, therefore, with Peter Sparks that the success of such an endeavor would likely depend on the intervention of a modern-day Napoleon 2.0. Consequently, alternative strategies were needed. When it comes to the administrative challenges, the good news is that almost all of these challenges, with the exception of translation and travel costs, can be resolved relatively easily. All that is needed is the eradication of three flaws that could be identified. Well, first, the available information in general does not cover all European member states, and it is often not kept up to date, or at least it is not possible to determine when they have been updated for the last time. And it is often spread across various websites, so that it's very difficult to actually find the information that is already existing. So all of these flaws can be eradicated through the employment of a central database, such as the European Judicial Network that is already in place, where the available information can be stored in a central level and would have to be regularly updated by the member states. Regarding the risk of cultural legal misperceptions, it must be concluded that it's inextricably connected to the diversity of cultures within Europe. Therefore, it is impossible to eliminate this risk completely if one is to converse cultural diversity. Nevertheless, the risk can be minimalized through the free disposal of accessible information. So if parties who are interested in acquiring real estate in a different country can find the necessary information in a way that they can understand them, then this challenge can be reduced significantly. Also, in the context of legal challenges, we run against the fact that easily accessible, complete, and updated information is lacking. So also, to some extent, legal challenges can be remedied through that. In addition to tackle challenges surrounding the registrability of foreign deeds, it was explored whether certain standardization measures or the creation of private international law would benefit the reduction of the legal challenges. Yet, inspiration was sought in this regard from the European Succession Regulation. And for now, given the high number of requests for preliminary ruling that reached the European Court of Justice in the context of the European Succession Regulation, the advice would be to first do in-depth research into how the European Succession Regulation works in practice before any advice can be given whether a European deed of transfer should be created. And finally, when it comes to the technological challenges, in-depth research would have been required into the different technological standards that are being used by different European countries before it can be established whether any new technologies such as smart contracts or blockchain can be used to facilitate cross-border real estate transactions on a technical level. Yet, such an ambitious project, though highly interesting, would have gone beyond the scope of this thesis and will therefore have to be the subject of subsequent research. Well, this concludes the overview of my PhD, and I now give the word back to the prorector. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor van Dijk. Professor van Dijk is Professor of Private Law at our university, and he is also the chair of the assessment committee. And I'm very happy to give now the floor to Professor van Dijk, who is joining us online in this ceremony.
Thank you very much, dear co-rector. And dear candidates, yes, I think what I've seen in your presentation as well as in your book is exactly what you are. You come well prepared and you're very thorough in things, and also very timely. Your presentation was timed very accurately. I've very much enjoyed reading your book. Again, it is very thorough, and it has a lot of information in there, and also inspiration for how to move forward. And I would like to invite you to discuss with me a little bit more about what that solution looks like. And for this, I would specifically like to focus on your strategy number one, the centralized database for cross-border real estate transactions. So in your study, you define several challenges, and you've also shown them on the presentation, 9 of which only arise in a cross-border setting, including the choice of a legal practitioner, referring citizens to the correct authority, and also you mentioned the different stages of technological development there. Then on my page 559 and 550, but I have the old version, so I'm not sure if the book is actually consistent in pages. It doesn't matter. But what you say there is that the most promising approach to counter many of these challenges that arise in the context of cross-border real estate transactions seems to lie in setting up a centralized database in which all relevant information is structured according to a common template, regularly updated, and covers all European countries. Of course, the first question is, can the challenges that you identify actually be solved by means of technology? And you kind of answer that question yourself, so I'm not going to ask you to re-answer this same question. You say, it sounds promising, but it's also resource heavy and expensive. And people need to know about it. If they don't know about it, they also cannot really use it. It does raise the question, what kind of functionality should that database have? And with functionality, I don't mean the technical functionality, but more the legal functionality. And I think one of your answers will be that it should offer digital deeds for registration in a certain country. But what does that exactly entail? What type of information is then necessary or essential to have included, and how to realize that? And I ask you that because I'm interested in not only the centralized approach, which is often a cumbersome road, if you want to kind of pull all the data out of member states' registers and then try to put it in a European register, that's a lot of work. And also with software degeneration, it's also going to probably lead to a possibly failed project because it's just too difficult to realize. So I'm wondering, could you also have and adopt a decentralized database? So for instance, when we talk about contact tracing apps, or so-called Corona apps, a decentralized option works as follows. You basically store the information of who you've been in touch with, in contact with on your own phone, and you receive a message when somebody who has the virus was in your proximity and was tested positively. And only then you get a match, and the match is basically entered locally. So for land registration systems, could you develop a similar database or a similar architecture? So you would develop a system where you fire a request on a central level, like on the European level, for instance, and you fire a request to the local national registry you're seeking information from, or when you want to send information to. The advantage is that you can basically build a system on top of the existing system specifically for this purpose, and it can preserve the architecture of existing databases while stimulating the exchange of information. I'm curious if that's a realistic option. And again, it comes back to then the question, what are the technical or legal requirements that need to go in that database? So I invite you for a discussion and your views on, to give your views on this matter. Do you think such a decentralized option would be an option at all? And if so, and more generally, what would be needed to have included in whatever database? So what are the legal requirements, basically, or the legal specifications? I look forward to your thoughts and answers.
Yes, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I think before I'm answering the many questions that you've posed, I think there might be one remark to make things a bit clearer when we talk about registers. So I think there are two different options on how we can progress from here. So on the one hand, the idea could be to indeed eradicate all national land registries and cadastral authorities and use their databases, so everything that's stored in the land registers, to store that in a giant European land register. And of course, that is not desirable, as I've just said. But what I was referring to when I was referring to the European Judicial Network is not so much the content that is included in the national land registers, but more practical information. So what we are seeing, for example, on the level of the European land registrars, they have a database of certain templates and questions that they've asked to the different land registrars active in the participating countries to get a better understanding of how land registration works, who can access information that land registers are publicly available, who is the land register, what are the contact details, etc. And we see very similar attempts when it comes to the European notaries. So they have created a vast majority of projects to facilitate that information exchange, not only on the level of the European notaries. So if you're, for example, talking about the European Notarial Network, that offers concrete help to the European notaries to find a way to get sort of checklists to know exactly what kind of documents they need if they're confronted with many different kinds of cross-border transactions. There are even possibilities for notaries to work together in a secured platform, which is called the EOFIDES. There are even a lot of databases and tools that are being designed for the European citizens, such as the possibility to look up whether in a foreign country you can find a notary that actually speaks your own language. Or even find information such as there's a website called Buying Property in Europe, which provides very accessible information for the ordinary, non-legally trained citizen on what kind of information they would need to buy a house in a different member state, whether it's what kind of documents they need, to whom they need to turn to, whether there's a notary involved, etc., etc. Well, the issue with these, I mean, although these initiatives are fascinating and they're truly helpful, the problem with these initiatives is that they are located in a lot of different websites and a lot of different places on the internet. And unless you know that the information exists, you won't find it. Because nobody who would not a European citizen who would be interested in figuring out how land registration works or who they need to contact if they need information from, let's say, the land register in Germany, they would never have the idea to look up, to even know what LRA is, let alone to look up the website of LRA, and then to navigate through the website of LRA to actually find out where the information is. So in other words, the problem that we see here is that there's already a wealth of information, and a lot of groups are very active in the field and are trying to reinvent the wheel by principally collecting the same information over and over again. So the problem that we see there is that the information is there. A lot of people put in a lot of time and effort into this. But in the end, we can ask ourselves whether it really has the intended purpose, because people cannot find it, and be that a European citizen or the notary or the land registrar in a different country. One of the problems also being that there's only a limited amount of cooperation between land registrars and notaries on a European level. So therefore, there's not that much cooperation when it comes to the design of new projects. So therefore then, if we could all in, and that is indeed also the plan of the European Commission in the end, if we can create all of that information and put it in the European Judicial Network for civil and commercial matters, and this is indeed what it is designed for, and there's already a lot of information stored in that. But again, not always for all European member states, not always up to date, or at least we have no idea how old the information is that we can find there. So if we could all integrate that information centrally somewhere and ensure that all member states put in the information and that there is a duty to regularly update the information, and we create that as a one-stop shop. I always have to concentrate when I say that. Then we can actually achieve what the purpose is that everybody knows where to find and where to look. And we don't leave it to the European citizens or the legal practitioners to having to try to find out whether projects actually exist that could make their lives better. So that is the answer to part of the first question. Looking into decentralized databases, I think that question related more to the situation in which you would ask certain information from the land register from a different country. And that really depends, of course, on whether the land register is open or not, publicly accessible. So in the Netherlands, that would not be a real problem. And in fact, in the most European countries, that would not be a problem because information can be accessed freely upon paying of a small fee. But there are also systems such as Germany, where it is very difficult to actually get the information that you're looking for. So it would really require maybe even certain checks and balances to see who would be allowed to require that information. So if you're looking in Germany, then there might be a chance that information could be transferred to another legal practitioner in a different member state, but not necessarily to a European citizen that is interested in asking that information, because that would be contrary to the German registration law. And also comparing that to the Corona app, I think in case of a Corona app, it's very clear who the addressee is, and then you can send information without that person even having to look for that information that they need. When it comes to asking information from the land register, it is of course a bit more, well, it's a bit of a different situation because the legal practitioner or the European citizen for that purpose would have to actively indicate that they wish a certain piece of information from a different land register. And when we already have that information, that you require certain activity of a European citizen or a legal practitioner in a different field, then there are already projects in that field that have tried to fill the void of that. So looking into ULIS, which has been dissolved, but will revive again eventually in the context of the European notarial network, in the European judicial network. And we've also seen IMOLA, that is realized by the European Land Registry Association, that is fulfilling a similar aim. So in that way, I think the problem has already been addressed.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Cook. And Professor Cook is a visiting professor of law at Oxford University and also judge in the first tier tribunal land registration division. She is also a member of the assessment committee, and I would like to welcome her very much to Maastricht University. She is joining us online. It's a real honor to have you here in this ceremony, and I'm very happy to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Katja. Can you hear me?
You're fine, thank you.
Good. Okay. Okay. If you can't hear me, just wave at me. It's a great privilege to be here. I very much enjoyed reading your thesis. Thank you very much. I was also delighted to receive your book a couple of weeks ago. I haven't had time to explore the book very much, but it was great to see St. Thomas Aquinas on the first page. I'm very conscious in reading your thesis that England and Wales is the awkward character. We have common law, not civil law. We don't do notaries. We don't have a cadaster. What I wanted to ask, I felt that England and Wales was a very brave choice for one of your jurisdictions for comparison. Do you think that really England and Wales is so fundamentally different from the other European legal systems that it's perhaps not possible to facilitate transactions involving land in England and Wales to the same extent as it is possible to facilitate them, to facilitate transactions that don't involve English or Welsh land? Are we just too much the odd one out?
Well, esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, Brexit was a surprise when I was conducting my PhD research, given that it only occurred while I was already researching and had already more or less written my chapter on English law after Brexit went finally through. So that was a bit of a surprise that I had to navigate with, but I hope I managed somehow sufficiently. So at least at the time I handed in the book, England was still a member state of the European Union. Well, the question, of course, is it really that different? And I've found if we are purely looking at the way the English land register is organized, then I found that there were remarkable similarities with the Dutch system, actually. So both have been centralized, both are very much digitalized, and therefore there's a chief land registrar. There's a number of caseworkers that are helping to actually process all of these deeds that come in. So in that way, I think that the English system is much and the Dutch system are much more related in a way than if we were to compare the Dutch system with the German system or the Belgian system. So I think in that way, it is not the odd jurisdiction out. And even if you're looking into the European Land Registration Association and the different projects that they have facilitated, and I'm thinking especially about the Probaker project, and the fact that it was even England that joined in a Probaker 2 project and actually participated in that, and to show that it's actually possible to work with a multilingual deed and to have a foreign deed registered in England, which is possible in at least 50% of all of the jurisdictions that participate in the European Land Registry Association, according to their own research. So I think in that way, England has shown that it is very much capable of dealing with these situations, simply taking into consideration that it is indeed possible to register foreign deeds, although it might be necessary for an English licensed conveyancer or solicitor to identify the IDs of the parties, which is something that is reserved for the English profession, but it's a thing that or a duty that can be easily negotiated. And therefore, I don't think that the fundamental differences, despite the fact that we do speak about common law and civil law systems, have such an impact when it comes to the facilitation of cross-border transactions within the legal framework that already exists.
Thank you very much. I noticed that you'd started work before Brexit happened, before the referendum, before we left the EU, and I imagine that must have been a bit of a shock in the course of your research. Do you think that the departure of England, or of the UK from the European Union has an impact on your research conclusions?
I think in the end it will not have such a drastic influence than I first thought. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of the challenges that we come across in case of cross-border real estate transactions, they can be solved through administrative means. So by facilitating information, by making sure that notaries in country A or conveyancers or solicitors in country A can actually find the land register in a different country. So to foster the exchange of that information. So given that I'm not proposing any legal means, so I'm not proposing a European deed, for example, or the integration of all the information in the European land register, I do not think that it will have, in the end, such a big difference. And even if you're looking into the European succession regulation, for example, even when England was still a European member state, they were not participating in that regulation either. So in the end, I think it was a challenge, an additional challenge, then was different than the challenges found in cross-border real estate transactions, of course. But in the end, I think it's possible to navigate through that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes my questions.
Thank you so much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Roep, who is Professor of Property Law at the University of Würzburg and who is also a member of the Assessment Committee. And like most of the members of the Assessment Committee, she is also joining us online in this ceremony. Like I said, I very much welcome her to our university today. And Professor Roep has the floor.
Thank you very much, dear Prorector. It's a pleasure and a great honor to be participating in this title defense today. I was immensely impressed reading your dissertation, Katja, and it was a wonderful joy to read it. And I think this is due to your talent for looking at technical details and really going in depth with your analytical skill, at the same time putting everything into the greater context, never losing the scope, the overarching aim of your paper from your side, and bringing joy to the whole thing. From a German point of view, it is very rare that people actually enjoy land registration law. It's considered a very dry subject, and everybody who talks to me about these prejudices, I will be very happy to refer to your book, because you really bring joy and even passion to this subject. Now, I was impressed by how you analyze many practical aspects of registration and the different players. And as you just showed us in your presentation, how everybody who is involved in the procedure, and also the many different approaches which have been undertaken so far towards harmonization, or at least exchange of information. And on the one hand, it's, well, surprising that there have been so many projects already, as you mentioned, ULIS, Quebeco, Imola, etc. But they all seem to be running in a way parallel to each other and not very coordinated. They all seem to be instigated by certain interest groups with a certain aim in mind, but they don't seem to interact a lot. So I wonder how we could maybe encourage cooperation and coordination. And the other issue I noted is that everybody is very happy to exchange information. But going further with harmonization, actually harmonizing the substantive part of registration law, that seems to be quite an issue. And I'm speaking from somewhat painful recent experience. Some of the interest groups involved in registration seem to be very much against it. There is the famous fear of German notaries of anything which might impair the integrity of the German Grundbuch. As you just mentioned, some acts are reserved for English solicitors only, and I have been told that at least some French notaries are quite skeptical about anything that might take business away from them. So I wonder how one could dispel these fears that harmonization will lead to loss of control, loss of power, and encourage stakeholder groups to maybe proactively participate in harmonization.
Well, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your questions. I think it's not only reserved to German lawyers who think that land registration is a very dry area of the law. I have heard this comment a lot of times during my PhD research, and I hope that I could convince at least some that it is not as dry as people would think it is. You're indeed your observation is indeed very right, that there are a lot of projects in this area, and there's a lot of parallel, and there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel. And I think one of the reasons why that also occurred is that nobody had the overview. So there were a lot of interest groups, and they're very interested in helping the European citizens, so they all have the same aim, and that is to help European citizens to make sure the EU internal market works properly. But in the end, they have lost sight of what is happening around them. And they've also sometimes lost sight of the question of what are the exact problems that we're trying to solve. So of course you can create a project, but what I've also been missing, that's also what I'm describing in the book, is that if you're looking at the project descriptions, we are often missing a very specific analysis of the different problems that actually exist, and also an assessment of whether the proposed project is actually suitable to address that. In that sense. So therefore, yes, there is a definite lack of coordination. So we see that especially, as I said, when it comes to European land registrars and the European notaries. So we see, for example, the Quebeco project that tries to facilitate cooperation of legal practitioners in two countries with a multilingual deed. And basically, when you're looking at the Quebeco project, which involves the land registrars, there's a second land registrar involved in the process to ensure that all of the registration requirements are being met, while at the same time the European notaries are working on a similar project in the context of the EOFIDES project. And there we see that instead of a second land registrar, a second notary is added to help the project. And of course, there was a lot of criticism also from the European notaries on a Quebec project, especially as you've already mentioned them and name dropped them, France and Germany. And some of the criticism, I think, needs to be taken by heart and cannot just be dismissed. But what would be very desirable indeed, also considering that the European Commission is financing projects organized by ELRA, projects organized by the CNUE, it would also be in the interest of the taxpayers' monies if these two organizations would actually work together instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. Well, when it comes then to the harmonization of registration requirements, yes, that is a very interesting question, because we see problems in that area, especially in the European succession regulation. And having worked at the Dutch land register, I've seen that from a practical experiences how many problems can occur when you try to create a European regulation that aims to harmonize to some extent the laws of the different member states, but that are not thought through well enough, or at least sometimes you're creating this regulation, and then at the end of the day, you have to let it evolve in practice to see what exactly are the consequences of such a regulation. But taking also into consideration that there are, I believe, already 5 cases that have been addressed by the European Court of Justice, and as we speak, there are 6 more cases pending in front of the European Court of Justice. I mean, that is just impressive for European succession, and not in a good sense, that has been adopted in 2015. So we see all the problems that are occurring when we are trying to harmonize registration requirements in that regulation, and in the context of a European certificate of succession that would be very similar to, in a way, to a European certificate of transfer, if we were to go down that route. So therefore, this is something that I think would be in the interest of all, to do more research into the European succession regulation, how it works in practice, because right now, nobody really knows. And we only see some of that coming back in the context of court decisions. So even if you're looking at, to just give one example, in the European succession certificates that are being issued by Germany, and according to German registration law, you're not allowed to actually specify the different goods that fall under a succession, and therefore also not indicate the cadastral code of a plot of land. And those are being offered for registration in Austria. And according to Austrian land registration law, it is required that you have a cadastral code, because otherwise you cannot link that the certificate to the plot of land. And then what happens eventually is that the European citizen is the one who is caught, who just lost a loved one, who is caught in this ping pong game between different jurisdictions, who each insist on their registration requirements.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Akkermans. Professor Akkermans is Professor of Property Law at our university and also a member of the Assessment Committee. Professor Akkermans has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Katja, I've read your impressive study with great interest, and it's been really a pleasure to stand on the sidelines and see you work so hard on your project, as well as to see you develop yourself in such a fully fledged legal researcher. The book reads, as I've gotten to know you from since you were a bachelor student at our faculty, it's a thorough and in-depth study of a subject that not many have dared to engage with so thoroughly and deeply. It shows your willingness to engage with foreign legal systems and your incredible perseverance in finding out the specifics of such a system. Not only of your direct research project, but in true Maastricht and Van Erp style, also of the context in which the problem at hand functions. Now, I've had the opportunity to ask you a question on the basis of your research before. As a part of your graduation from the Maastricht Honors Program for master students, we already discussed aspects of land registration. I think back very fondly on that exchange of thought that was followed by many more in the past years. The topic I want to address today will therefore not come as a surprise to you, because in many ways it's a continuation of that discussion we've had all those years ago in Maastricht. In your study, you are very clear on what it is that you seek to achieve. You want to learn how cross-border conveyances in land can be facilitated. So you state on page 3. Such a research question, in my view, is based on a number of assumptions. 1, apparently there is such a thing as cross-border conveyances of land. This is important to establish, as land itself, of course, does not tend to move between jurisdictions. Secondly, and more important, there is the question of whether we should actually facilitate cross-border conveyancing. It is that point that I would like to debate with you. You could, as you do, argue that these conveyances happen and that therefore we are confronted with a fait accompli. We both know this is the case. However, to respond to that fact we have just established together is something altogether different. How to do that? Your approach is, in my view, careful when it comes to this. Based on the assumptions that we could do something, you proceed by posing a number of research questions. Page 4 and 5 of your study. In my reading, you seek to describe, rather than to argue, if and how the question of cross-border conveyancing should really be addressed. And I'm challenging you a little bit here. This is a choice you implicitly and sometimes explicitly make in your study, although at certain moments one can read between the lines, I think, that you have an opinion on this. You do not, on page 15, exclude EU internal market law or the EU civil justice area from the scope of your study. And you engage with this in your proposal for that central registration authority you just explained us about. There are, in your view, however, much less invasive measures that can reach the same result. And you find this, I summarize in my own words, in information sharing and mutual recognition, rather than in substantive harmonization of registration and property law. More than that, you write on page 490, would increase the complexity of land registration practice and must therefore be dismissed. End of quote. Isn't that turning the world upside down? Isn't land registration there to facilitate trade rather than to restrict it? If it's too complex now, we must think of another system to serve us, rather than the other way around. By not going the full extent towards a proposal of substantive European rules or the creation of a fully fledged European deed and European registry, are you not proposing an intermediate solution rather than a more fully fledged solution? You yourself state that in Kubička, the European Court of Justice is already taking us for a walk when it comes to the legislature trying to restrict the effects of EU legislation. Once you start legislating, there might not be an end to it. Yes, there are significant differences between the laws of the member states. Yes, these are sometimes so systemic and deeply connected to culture and historical development that a common core cannot easily be found. But that is an argument now that cross-border conveyancing is real and increasingly so. To replace these systems, I would argue, with a European legal system to create European legal certainty rather than not to do it. And so here comes my question. You state that on page 535, we are still in the beginning stage of bringing light into the black box in which cross-border real estate transactions are caught, so that we are tempted to build the discussion in this field on a fundament of hypothesis. As a result, in order to formulate useful proposals to combat the challenges with which the different stakeholders are confronted in cross-border real transactions, more groundwork is needed. How about the functioning of the internal market? What if we apply Kubička to your proposal for a European land registration authority, which you already consider going too far in terms of cost and efforts? Is that not the same as implicitly proposing to harmonize land registration law in Europe? I think, and this will be no surprise to you, you don't go far enough. I hope and therefore invite you to address this in the perspective of the more normative perspective I have just tried to frame your study in. I look forward to your answer.
Well, esteemed opponent, thank you for your many questions. Indeed, I have sort of expected such a question based on the many discussions that we had, and that also led to the decision to try to create a sort of objective framework to justify the decisions I take in the last chapter. And that's also why I included chapter 2 to actually provide an overview of the challenges, trying to have this discussion on an objective level to see, okay, if those are all the challenges that we can identify, and perhaps there are more if you would ask land surveyors, if you were to ask notaries that are specialized in these cross-border transactions, then maybe there are more challenges attached to that. And I've also not claimed that I produce a conclusive overview of that. But based on the overview that I've created, I think there are less invasive measures possible to reach the desired result. And therefore, I have also decided to not create a European Land Registry and Cadastral Association, also because it's simply not feasible on a political level. So one of the big points of departure that I've taken, though, in my PhD research is to combine theory and practice, and hence the choice for a design-oriented research question rather than a normative research question or a descriptive research question that is more traditional in legal research, to actually try to use the insight from academia and the theoretical insights to actually try to create or propose solutions that would work in practice after all. And in the end, when it comes to any sorts of proposals that aim to facilitate cross-border real estate transactions, then there's one thing that we need to keep in mind, and that's something that's also not stressed enough, is that we need to be very careful when we propose these measures, because at the end of the day, if these measures fail, then this will have a detrimental effect on the economy of an entire country, let alone if we propose a measure for a European solution, then this would have a detrimental effect on the European economy. So therefore, we have to be very careful and sensitive to any of these measures that we are proposing. Well, when it comes to your question whether cross-border transactions exist, yes, I claim that they do exist. I mean, in the end, as soon as we do have a cross-border element, and it could be a foreign seller, it could be a foreign buyer, it could be a plot of land that is located in a different member state, it could be any combination of that. We do have a cross-border transactions that are more complicated, as I've shown also in chapter 2 of my book, than a comparable national transaction. And that was one of the difficulties researching this topic, is the fact that there are no statistics, or almost no statistics available to show how often cross-border real estate transactions actually occur on a yearly level at this moment in the European Union. So there are some countries that actually have these statistics, for example, Spain. Other countries also have statistics, but they're often only focused to buyers from Russia or China. And therefore do not necessarily include the European transactions. So therefore I had to look into a workaround, and therefore look into statistics that are available, generally speaking, on the cross-border movement of European citizens, because after all, if I'm moving to a different country, I will have to live somewhere. And maybe I rent a place, but there's also a good chance that I might buy a place there. And also the statistics available for cross-border successions that eventually also led to the urgency to create a European succession regulation also point in a direction that cross-border real estate transactions also occur on a frequent basis, and will occur on an even more frequent basis in the near future. So therefore we do need to look into that, and even this does not even include any vacation homes that are being bought. That also does not include any buy-to-let investments. So they also need to be added to that to create the full picture. With regard to, let me see, if we're looking into the Kubička case, then we need to be what we need to understand with the Kubička case is that it did not as such harmonize substantive property law. Because all the Kubička did was to say, well, if the technique differs to transfer a certain right, then that right must be acknowledged. So the harmonization is more on a technique, but not so much on a substantial level. But even if we are only looking at the technique, then we already see all the problems that this is causing in legal practice, let alone if you would substantially try to harmonize registration laws. And therefore, my conclusion would be to take indeed the more careful approach, trying in the interest of the economy of the European countries.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Van Vliet, who is Assistant Professor of Property Law at our university and who is also a member of the assessment committee. And I'm happy to give the floor now to Dr. Van Vliet.
Thank you, Professor Smits. Dear candidates, dear Katja, I hope you can hear me clearly. First of all, congratulations on this highly interesting study of comparative property law. The book addresses in great detail how real estate transactions take place in 3 jurisdictions and show from a very practical perspective which problems may occur in cross-border transactions. Now I'd like to focus on, let's say, a law and economics question. It's about additional costs of cross-border transactions. As you indicate in your thesis, cross-border real estate transactions would be so much easier if the legal systems involved had the same property law and the same registration system. However, unification cannot be expected anytime soon. Therefore, you seek other solutions. You conclude that most of the practical solution the most practical solution is to set up an information system that needs to be updated regularly. However, I wonder whether the problem needs to be solved at all. Every solution you suggest creates huge costs to be borne by the European taxpayer. If parties wish to sell or buy real estate abroad, they can always contact a local conveyancer or notary. That seems to be the safest and easiest solution, even if it creates some additional costs to those parties. That is only to be expected. Doing business in foreign countries may create additional costs. Your proposals seek to shift those costs to the taxpayer. Is that a fair choice? For the buyer involved, there may be a cheaper solution, namely title insurance, a form of insurance that originated in the US and that is now also widely available in Europe for a one-off payment per transaction of, roughly speaking, 100 euros for residential property. Why then incur possibly huge costs to set up and maintain a European system?
Hello, Mr. Opponent. Thank you for your question. The cross-border real estate transactions, to my knowledge, have not been really assessed through the eyes of law and economics yet. At least I've not come across that from that perspective. And therefore it is, and that is also a problem that I've encountered in my own research. It's very difficult to really assess whether the project as such are more beneficial in terms of transaction costs than a normal transaction, where you simply have to be willing to pay for the services of, for example, a foreign notary who needs to provide you with certain information, etc., or even for the registration costs of the deed in a foreign member state. That is also one of the reasons why it's very difficult to assess also the success of some of these projects that have been proposed, such as the Quebec project, where you would need a second land registrar, or the EOFIDES project, where you would need a second notary to assess that. So in order to do that, we would actually have to see...
You may briefly conclude your reply.
Okay. So you would actually need to have the figures to actually determine that. And in lack of these figures, it is very difficult to assess whether integration would of this information in a centralized database would actually be detrimental to the finances and to the taxpayers' money. But that would indeed require further research.
Ms. Zimmermann, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The Decree Committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company, both here and online, await the results of our deliberations and our return here in this room. Ms. Zimmermann, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van Erp is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
It begins, as you know, with a promise. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Good. Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Katja Zimmermann, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Sehr geehrte Frau Dr. Zimmermann, das hört sich doch gut an, nicht? Dear Katja, first of all, my sincere congratulations. And also, of course, on behalf of my colleague Rainer Schulze, with your PhD degree. You've shown what the Maastricht Law Faculty is all about. As a student from Germany, you came to Maastricht to study law. You learned, next to, well, German, which you already speak, and fluent English, you learned to speak Dutch. You followed a course in Spanish, and I understand you now even speak Hebrew. You wrote a comparative law thesis with my colleague and friend Rainer Schulze from Münster and me as supervisors. This shows what Europe can and what Europe should be. I'm really sorry that the COVID-19 restrictions prevent so many of your family and friends from Germany to be present today. But at least the ceremony could be held hybrid. We have some people present. It is quite an impressive work that is lying in front of us. 535 pages, plus 75 pages annexes, plus 3 pages further annexes. So it's a lot. But we have a history when it comes to big theses. You graduated in the Maastricht European Law School program and the more traditional Netherlands law program. And following the old Dutch tradition, you are now truly a meester in de rechten, a master of laws, the laws in plural. But however, historically, this master of laws referred to being a master in secular and, in fact, Roman, not secular, and Canaan law. And it is precisely this which you would like to achieve next to your academic career as a university lecturer. But I will come back to that. Now, having ideas about writing a PhD thesis is not the same as realizing that idea. You were fortunate enough that both the Maastricht Institute for Transnational and Euro-Regional Cross-Border Cooperation and Mobility, ITM, and the Netherlands Cadastre Land Registry and Mapping Agency felt that your ideas were more than worthwhile developing, and they supported you, making the writing of this thesis possible. For several years, you had a double job, working as a PhD researcher at Maastricht University and as an advisor for EU law at the Netherlands Land Registry. You commuted between Maastricht and Apeldoorn by train, and I'm certain you began to discover that although Limburg, with its beautiful rolling hills, is a very attractive Dutch province, that you could live here close to your parents and relatives in Germany, the north of the Netherlands also has its beauty. Vast open areas where you can look around far away and your view unlimited by a forest or a nearby hill. You're now going to explore this further in your new job at the University of Groningen. I already mentioned that you want to step into a very old tradition as to your law degree. You want truly be a master of laws. You began a study theology at Tilburg University, started thinking about how to bring the world of law and the world of theology together. The right of land ownership is the most pivotal, the most complicated part of property law. It gave rise to many political, ideological, legal, and moral questions. It can therefore not really surprise that you began reflecting and doing research on the more theoretical side of precisely this tenet of property law, land ownership, in light of the pressing need to combat climate change. The more technical side of property law begins where the more deep-rooted questions are no longer asked, or perhaps I should say are ignored. And those questions are the status quo of wealth distribution, not questioning why wealth is distributed as it is, and why an owner has so much freedom. The thesis makes very clear that you have an in-depth understanding of legal technique, but you also want to understand what lies behind this status quo, and whether we should not rethink ownership in that light. And you do this by researching the legal and theological aspects of climate change and how sustainability can be achieved to protect and preserve our living environment. Not only among our legal colleagues and friends has this been noted, but your approach and sincere commitment do not get unnoticed as well by theologians. And you recently have been accepted, I think I can say that, as a postdoctoral fellow at the Angelicum Thomistic Institute at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. So my congratulations again. That. Liebe Katja, jetzt gehe ich ziemlich formell weiter, obschon wir einander ganz privat duzen, aber wir sind ja in einer formellen Umgebung. Sie haben eine schöne Dissertation aus einer breiten europäischen und internationalen Perspektive geschrieben. Sie werden Ihre Karriere mit einer Vision fortsetzen, die nicht jeder hat, die Sie aber zu einer ganz besonderen Person macht. Ich wünsche Ihnen, Ihren Eltern und allen, die Ihnen nahestehen, viel Glück mit dieser Promotion. Genießen Sie diesen Tag gemeinsam und auf geht's in den Norden. Every good wish for your career, but particularly for you as a person. Congratulations.
Dear Dr. Zimmermann, also on behalf of the Board of Deans and the Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you have just acquired. It's a very special occasion, first of all for you, but also for the faculty, because it's the third degree that we're able to confer upon you as a faculty and as a university. This time it's the highest degree that is available that we have as a university. Now, I congratulate you on this. I also congratulate your family and friends, partly present here, partly also present online. And I wish you all the best in indeed your future professional and personal career. Now, I have a few practical remarks to make. And the first one is not a very pleasant remark, which is that there is no reception that can take place here in this building as we usually have. And I also have to ask all the people who are present here, or the participants here in the ceremony, to leave the aula through the first door on the right. So there's also no possibility to congratulate the young doctor. Unfortunately, there will be possibilities later on, but not here in this building. And I very much regret that, but it simply follows from the measures that we have in place here, and you all know why they are in place. I have to make an exception to that rule for 2 people in the audience who are allowed to take a photo still. So we're going to arrange for that, to have a photo of the young doctor together with her, their supervisors who are present, supervisor who is present, and the members of the degree committee who are present here in this meeting. And with that, I end this academic ceremony and again congratulate the young doctor.